At my granddaughter's graduation dinner, my son-in-law's father grabbed her by the wrist, leaned into her face and said, "You didn't deserve that diploma any more than your mother deserved to marry into this family." My daughter stood frozen. Her husband looked at his shoes, and Gordon Ashworth, retired VP of something or other at a Bay Street firm, smiled like he'd just made a clever point at a board meeting. My hands were steady. Steady in the way they'd learned to be over 38 years of work I'd never once mentioned at a family dinner. I excused myself, walked to the lobby of the restaurant, and made a phone call. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I hadn't seen my daughter in 6 weeks when she called about the dinner. Not a warm call. She sounded careful, the way she always did when she was managing 2 conversations at once. The one she was having with me, and the one she was already preparing to have with her husband afterward. "Marcus wants the whole family together to celebrate Sophie's graduation," she said. "His parents will be there." A pause. "Please just come, Dad." I drove from my house in Kanata to the restaurant in Yorkville they'd chosen. 2 hours. I didn't mind. At 67, you understand that the drive is sometimes the only quiet part of the evening. My daughter Margaret had married Marcus Ashworth 8 years ago. I remembered the wedding clearly. Not the ceremony, but the moment at the reception when Gordon Ashworth introduced himself to me by listing his credentials before asking my name. He'd built a career in commercial real estate financing out of Toronto, made money in the way men of his generation made money, by knowing the right people and never letting anyone forget it. His wife Elaine matched him perfectly, polished, deliberate, every sentence calibrated to remind you of your place relative to hers. Margaret had grown quieter each year since the wedding. I noticed it the way you notice a photograph fading, slowly, until one day the color is just gone. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus have no prices on the guest copies. Gordon had chosen it. Of course he had. My granddaughter Sophie, 22 years old and newly graduated from Dalhousie with a degree in environmental science, sat at the far end of the table looking like she was already counting the minutes until she could leave. When I arrived, Sophie lit up. "Grandpa Frank." She stood and hugged me properly the way she always had since she was small. Both arms, face pressed into my shoulder. I felt Margaret watching us from across the table, a complicated expression on her face. Relief and apology mixed together. Gordon was already holding court. He stood to shake my hand. "Frank, good of you to make the drive." Not a question, not warmth. An acknowledgement, like a manager signing off on an attendance sheet. "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. The evening started the way those evenings always did. Gordon spoke. Everyone else organized their responses around what he might want to hear. Elaine nodded at appropriate intervals. Marcus deferred to his father so reflexively it had become invisible to him. Margaret monitored everyone's comfort levels except her own. Sophie tried. I watched her try. She spoke about her thesis, about a wetlands restoration project she'd been part of near Truro. It was good work, important work. Gordon listened with the expression of a man waiting for the speaker to finish. "Environmental science," he said when she was done. "Not exactly a growth sector, is it? Not much call for that in the private market." "There's quite a bit of call, actually," Sophie said. She said it evenly, without aggression. I felt a small surge of pride. Gordon's expression shifted. He wasn't accustomed to being countered. "I'm just saying, practically speaking, Marcus and Margaret are going to be carrying you for a while. It might be worth considering something more applicable." Margaret said nothing. Marcus was looking at his bread plate. I said, "Sophie's work is federally funded. She already has a position lined up with Environment and Climate Change Canada." I'd known this for months. Sophie had called me the day the offer came through. Gordon glanced at me. A brief recalibration. Then, government work. Well, at least there's a pension. He said pension the way some men say consolation prize. The main course arrived. The conversation moved, or tried to. Elaine made comments about the restaurant's decor. Gordon talked about a golf property he'd looked at in Muskoka. Sophie sat quietly beside me, eating carefully. Then, around the time dessert was being considered, Sophie said she was thinking of moving to Halifax for the position. Good city, close to the work. a chance to build something of her own. Elaine looked at Margaret. You comfortable with her being that far away? It's her life, Margaret said quietly. Well, Elaine smiled in that particular way. I suppose if the expectations were different coming up, that's the result. Margaret apologized. For what, I wasn't entirely sure. For raising a daughter with ambition, perhaps. Sophie put down her fork. Gran, she said with more patience than I would have managed. I'm sitting right here. That's when Gordon set down his wine glass, turned to his wife, and said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "This is exactly what I told Marcus before the wedding. You can't expect a different outcome when the foundation isn't there." The table went quiet. Sophie looked at him. What foundation? Sophie. Marcus's voice was a warning. No, I'd actually like to know what that means. Gordon turned to her then, and his face had the calm of someone who has never once been meaningfully challenged. He reached out and closed his hand around her wrist, the way you might restrain a child about to do something embarrassing. It means, he said, leaning in, that you didn't earn that diploma any more than your mother earned a place in this family. You've been handed things your whole life by people who didn't know what they were doing. He released her wrist and sat back. That's not an insult. That's just an honest assessment. Sophie stared at him, her face had gone very still. Marcus said nothing. He picked up his wine glass. I looked at my daughter. Her eyes were on the tablecloth. Her shoulders had folded inward like she'd been trying to make herself smaller since 2016 and had nearly succeeded. Excuse me, I said. My voice came out calm, calmer than I expected. I walked to the lobby, past the maitre d' who didn't look up, and through the glass doors onto Yorkville Avenue. The September air was cool. I stood under the awning and took out my phone. The first call was to a woman named Patricia Noen. She'd articled under me 20 years ago, built a practice, and was now one of the more respected family law litigators in Toronto. She answered on the second ring. Frank, it's late. I know. I'm sorry. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. If a person has been in a marriage with a consistent pattern of psychological diminishment, documented over years, and there's now a witnessed incident of physical contact during what could be characterized as an intimidation, what does the evidentiary picture look like for a protective application? A pause. Are we speaking hypothetically? We are not. Another pause. Is your daughter safe tonight? She will be. Call me tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. I'll clear my first hour. I ended the call and stood for another moment. 38 years. I'd spent 38 years as a Crown prosecutor and then as a senior advisor to the Federal Department of Justice. I'd argued before appellate courts. I'd worked on legislative reform affecting domestic abuse protections across 3 provinces. I had never once mentioned any of it at a family dinner, because I had wanted my daughter to love me as her father. Just her father. Not as the man who knew every mechanism of the system inside and out, not as someone to be managed or deferred to, just Dad. Gordon Ashworth had looked at me across a restaurant table and seen a quiet, retired man from Kanata who didn't know which fork to use for the fish course. He'd made his calculations accordingly. I returned to the table and sat down. Gordon was speaking again, something about property assessments in Rosedale. I picked up my water glass and waited. Sophie had moved her chair slightly away from the table. She was looking at her phone, not reading anything, just holding it, protecting herself with an object. Gordon, I said. He stopped. When you took Sophie's wrist just now, was that intentional? The table went very still. I beg your pardon? It was a straightforward question. When you physically restrained my granddaughter during the conversation, was that a deliberate choice? His expression did the thing I'd seen 1,000 times across tables from people who had always assumed their actions were invisible. A small contraction. A recalibration. I was making a point, he said. That's a dramatic interpretation of. I recorded the conversation from the moment I returned to the table, I said. I hadn't, but the statement served its purpose, and I would have ample documentation of other kinds by morning. I want to be transparent about that. Marcus found his voice. You, what? I also want to be transparent about something else. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. I spent 38 years in federal prosecution and justice policy. The last 12 of those years, I specialized in legislative frameworks for intimate partner violence and family law reform. I have colleagues across the Ontario court system, the federal ministry, and 3 or 4 family law practices in this city who I consider personal friends. I looked at Gordon. I'm telling you this not as a threat, but as a disclosure. I think it's relevant to whatever comes next. The silence lasted a long time. Elaine's hand had gone to her pearls. Marcus was looking at his father with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shock and a very old, very buried understanding. Margaret was looking at me. I looked back at her. I gave her the smallest nod. The same nod I'd given her the night she was 9 years old and afraid of a thunderstorm. And I told her without words that everything was going to be all right. She straightened in her chair. Just slightly, just enough. We left the restaurant separately. Sophie came with me in my car. Margaret said she'd follow. Marcus stayed behind with his parents. Sophie didn't speak until we were on the Gardner. Grandpa, how long have you known? About all of it, the way things were. Long enough. Why didn't you ever say anything? I thought about that for a moment. Because saying something to you about your mother's marriage was never going to change your mother's marriage. The only person who could change it was your mother. My job was to make sure she still had somewhere to go when she was ready. I glanced at her, and to make sure you knew you were worth something, no matter what anyone else decided you were worth. She looked out the window. The city moved past. He's done that before, she said. Not to me. But I've seen it with Mom, the wrist thing. I know. She always apologizes after. I know that too. Margaret called when we were almost to my hotel near King and Spadina. I planned to stay overnight. She said she was pulling into the parking structure. She sounded different. Not relieved exactly. More like someone who'd put down something heavy and was still figuring out what to do with their hands. She came up to the room. Sophie was already there, cross-legged on the bed, eating vending machine chips with the particular contentment of someone who has just escaped a terrible evening. Margaret looked at her daughter, then at me. Then she sat down in the chair by the window and said, "Dad, I need to know what you meant. At the restaurant. What comes next?" "What do you want to come next?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I've wanted to leave for 4 years. I just kept thinking it wasn't bad enough. That I was being oversensitive. That I was reading things wrong." "You weren't reading things wrong." "No," she said. "No, I don't think I was." Sophie moved from the bed and sat on the arm of her mother's chair and leaned her head against her shoulder. Margaret reached up and held her hand without looking, the automatic gesture of a mother who has done it 10,000 times. I called Patricia again the next morning at 7, as agreed. She walked me through the immediate options. Margaret came on the call. She asked clear questions. She took notes. By 10 o'clock, she had an appointment with Patricia's office for the following Tuesday, and a referral to a colleague who handled protective applications in family court. The documentation process took several weeks. Margaret kept a journal, Patricia's first instruction to every client, and what she wrote across those pages was a careful, precise account of 8 years of erosion. The wrist incident at the restaurant became one entry among many. Marcus's inaction documented. Elaine's comments documented. The pattern visible. Marcus's initial response was anger. He called my phone twice and left messages that were, in Patricia's words when I played them for her, inadvisable from an evidentiary standpoint. She said it with professional understatement. What she meant was that he had made things considerably worse for himself. Gordon retained a lawyer. A downtown firm. Expensive. The kind of practice that sends hand-delivered correspondence. They sent a letter suggesting that I had made defamatory statements at a restaurant and implying potential legal action. I forwarded it to a colleague from my justice days who specialized in civil litigation, who responded on my behalf in the kind of precise and comprehensive language that communicates, without being impolite, that the other party has made a significant miscalculation. We did not hear further on that front. What I did do, over the following weeks, was the same thing I'd always done professionally. I followed proper channels. I did not fabricate anything. I did not use my relationships to bend outcomes. I simply ensured that the existing record received appropriate attention. The Law Society of Ontario received a documented complaint regarding the conduct of one of the lawyers in Marcus's firm who had made a personal call to Patricia, attempting to discourage her from taking Margaret's case, a serious breach of professional standards. The complaint was accepted for review. A former colleague at the federal ministry who had been working on a regulatory review of certain financial disclosures and commercial real estate mentioned in passing that Gordon Ashworth's firm had some documentation worth a closer look. I mentioned what I had observed at family gatherings over the years. Nothing fabricated, nothing I hadn't witnessed. He thanked me and said he'd make note of it. I didn't knock anything down. I just stopped pretending the wind wasn't blowing. The family court proceedings moved with the particular pace of such things, slowly, then suddenly. Patricia was thorough. The protective application was granted in 6 weeks. Margaret and Sophie moved into a rental in the Glebe in Ottawa, close enough to me for Sunday dinners, far enough for their own life to begin. Marcus contested everything at first, then his counsel apparently had a frank conversation with him about the evidentiary position, because the contestation became considerably less energetic. The financial disclosure process revealed something Patricia described as interesting, and the family court judge described as a significant concern. Marcus had been moving household funds into an account connected to his father's holding company for approximately 3 years. The amounts were not small. Margaret had not been informed or consulted. This changed the nature of the proceedings materially. I watched from the gallery the afternoon the matter came before the judge. I hadn't planned to attend, but Margaret had asked me to be there, and I remembered that 9-year-old girl during a thunderstorm, and I drove the 2 hours without thinking twice. Gordon was there with Elaine. He looked across the gallery and found me sitting quietly in the 3rd row, in the same gray suit I wore to everything. His expression did the recalibration again, that small, private moment of understanding that his assessment of the situation had been incorrect from the beginning. I gave him the mildest nod. He looked away. Margaret testified clearly and steadily. She did not perform distress. She simply described what had happened, in the careful language of someone who had spent several months learning how to document her own experience. I recognized the particular quality of it, the way you learn over time to speak about difficult things without letting the difficulty overwhelm the clarity. That girl who got back up, I thought, she's still in there. The divorce was finalized the following spring. The financial settlement reflected the fund transfers and was, in Patricia's words, appropriate. Marcus received his share of the outcomes he'd chosen. Gordon's firm went through an audit that produced results I heard about secondhand, and which had nothing fabricated in them because nothing fabricated had been introduced. Sophie started her position with Environment and Climate Change Canada that May. She rented a small apartment in Halifax overlooking the harbor and sent me a photograph of the view from her kitchen window on her first morning there. I printed it and put it on my refrigerator. Margaret got a job she'd actually wanted for years, policy work with a women's advocacy organization in Ottawa. She called me on her first day, and her voice was the voice I remembered from before the wedding, from before the careful management of every sentence. I returned to my quiet routines. Morning walks along the Radeau River, the occasional lunch with colleagues who still called me Frank, or sometimes, old habits, Mr. Hollingsworth. A book group on Thursday evenings at the library branch on Woodruff. I had no need to tell anyone what I'd done or how any of it had worked. That was never the point. One evening in October, Margaret and Sophie came for dinner. We made tourcière because Sophie had asked for it, and because it was nearly the season, and because sometimes you make tourcière simply because you know how and the people you love are coming over. After dinner, Sophie said she had something to tell me. She'd been asked to contribute to a federal consultation on wetlands policy. She would be in the room with deputy ministers and environmental commissioners. She was 22 years old. "They want my thesis data," she said. "They actually want to use it." I looked at her across the table. I thought about Gordon Ashworth telling her she hadn't earned her diploma, telling her the foundation wasn't there. "Of course they do," I said. Margaret shook her head slowly. "Dad, all those dinners, all those times they spoke to you like, and you never said a word. It wasn't time yet." "How did you know when it was time?" I thought about that, about Sophie's wrist, about the way Margaret had looked at the tablecloth, about the moment when watching and waiting stops being patience and becomes something else. When someone gets hurt, I said, that's when it's time. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Later, Sophie helped me clear the dishes and told me she was thinking of getting a cat. She'd already named it, she said. Kepler, after the telescope. She wanted to know if I thought that was too on the nose. I think Kepler is an excellent name for a cat, I said. She laughed. The same laugh she'd had at 7 years old. Unguarded, immediate, completely her own. I washed the dishes and she dried them, and Margaret sat at the kitchen table drinking her tea, and the evening moved through its quiet stages the way evenings do when the worst is behind you and you've remembered who your people are. Outside, the Ottawa autumn was doing what it always does, turning everything brilliant and cold and brief. The kind of beautiful that reminds you nothing lasts, which is different from saying nothing matters, different in every way that counts. Sophie said goodnight first. She had an early train. She hugged me at the door with both arms, the same way she always had. After they left, I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes in the quiet. On the refrigerator, beside Sophie's photograph of Halifax Harbor, was a drawing Margaret had made when she was perhaps 8. A crayon house with a figure in the yard under a wobbly sun, with Daddy's house written in large letters across the bottom. I'd moved it from every kitchen I'd ever had. It had come with me from the house in Nepean to the apartment in the glebe to here. Some things you carry because they're worth carrying. I turned off the kitchen light and walked to the window. The street was quiet. A light snow had started, the first of the season. Small and tentative, and not quite sticking yet. I thought about Gordon Ashworth and where his certainties had led him. About Marcus and the accounting that follows when you treat the wrong as invisible long enough. About the careful machinery of consequence, which does not hurry and does not forget, and which I had learned over 38 years to trust. And then I stopped thinking about them. Because they were done, and my family was not. And there is always more to tend to in the direction of love than in the direction of whatever the opposite of love is. I went to bed. Outside, the snow kept falling. I keep thinking about Gordon's face at that restaurant table. The moment he understood that his calculations had been wrong from the beginning. Not the moment he was embarrassed. The moment before that, when he realized the error wasn't recent. That it went back years. That every dinner, every dismissal, every casual cruelty delivered across a table to my daughter or my granddaughter had been witnessed by someone who understood exactly what it was and exactly what it meant. That's the thing about consequences. They don't announce themselves in advance. They simply arrive, shaped precisely by what preceded them. I've thought a lot about what I could have done differently. I could have corrected Gordon the first time he spoke over Margaret at a family dinner. I could have told him who I was, let him recalibrate his behavior accordingly. For a while I wondered if that restraint was a mistake, but I don't think it was. People who treat others with contempt because they believe no one is watching don't change because you introduce yourself properly. They change, if they change at all, because the ground shifts beneath their assumptions. Gordon needed to show me who he was before anything else could happen, and he did, thoroughly. What I've learned, after 67 years and 38 of them spent inside systems designed to sort through exactly this kind of human behavior, is that 3 things determine how a life unfolds. Not wealth, not connections, not the size of the house on Redbud Trail or whoever's equivalent. 3 things: whether you know right from wrong and act on it when it costs you something, whether you've developed the judgment to understand what you're actually looking at, and whether you can hold yourself together long enough to do what needs to be done. Character, discernment, and endurance. Gordon had built an entire life around the assumption that only the first of those mattered, and only in the way other people performed it for him. Sophie understood all 3 before she was 22. She sat at that table and spoke clearly about work she believed in, absorbed a dismissal designed to diminish her, and countered it without cruelty. When Gordon grabbed her wrist, she didn't collapse and she didn't escalate. She looked at him. That's steadiness. That's not something you're given. That's something you build quietly over years of being told you're worth something by someone who means it. Margaret took longer. But that's not a criticism. It takes what it takes. The courage she found that night, the voice she used when she said, "I should have walked out years ago," that wasn't new. It had been there the whole time, underneath everything that had been layered on top of it. She just needed enough room to breathe. I didn't save them. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I opened a door. They walked through it themselves. Everything they've built since. Margaret's work, Sophie's position, the apartment in Halifax, the ordinary Tuesday evenings that are genuinely peaceful. They built that. I just made sure the obstruction was removed and the path was visible. The snow was falling the night they left for dinner. It kept falling after, and in the morning everything looked clean and quiet and entirely possible.